see all of you again tonight, and thank you, of course, for being here. We seem to have a little bit of a skeleton crowd. I think we had it in boys' class too. I guess there is a lot out of town, so I guess we'll remember them in our prayers and hope that everybody gets home safely. But of us that are here, it's good to see you. And I have something, at least that's been really exciting for me, getting an opportunity to study. And I hope that if I share it with you tonight, you'll understand what the point is. And I hope that you appreciate it as much as I do. And my excitement is just not for naught. But I wanted to do with you tonight is explain the different nations that conquered Jerusalem. And really as a whole, look at the history of Jerusalem and then make some points in Hebrews 12 when he brings up the history of the city of Jerusalem. Starting instead of way back in the past, but starting relatively recently, in 1917 recently. During World War I, many of you may be familiar with Lawrence of Arabia or General Allenby that was commander of the British forces there in Arabia. And as they start in Egypt, they begin taking over city by city up through Gaza and up through Israel, or what we know today as Israel, into the Ottoman Empire, and they're trying to make a way for the British forces to be able to get to Germany from the south. As they're doing this, Allenby has already taken major cities that are helping the war effort to fight the Ottoman Empire in World War I. However, in December of 1917, the Brits are down. They've lost a lot of battles in the war front in Europe. They're not exactly happy about where things are. And so Allenby decides to give the British people a Christmas present, as he calls it. He turns around and he goes and takes a city that the Ottomans really didn't care about, a city that actually had no strategic reasoning to own. It was actually a waste of resources at the time, but a city that would make all the people happy in the French and British nations that they had taken it. And that was the city of Jerusalem. He literally turns around and he goes back and makes sure all the media is with him, and he takes Jerusalem from the Ottoman Empire. It wasn't heavily fortified. Apparently it wasn't really that difficult. And then he made sure all the cameras were in front in the city as he walked in, got out of his car, and he walked on his own feet through the gates of Jerusalem. And then all the media back home got to, put all in the newspapers that the British control Jerusalem. England controls Jerusalem. And it was such a big deal for the people there. And it was this big morale booster. We've saved Jerusalem in this sense. Why is that so significant? And I know we know the answer, but before we go there, think about this for just a second. Jerusalem, or the mountain it's on, Mount Zion, why is this place so significant? Because it has nothing to do with the mountain. The mountain is basically just kind of a big green hill. And if you compared the mountain to many of the mountains we have in the Appalachians make Mount Zion look like it's just a little hill. Maybe most of them, or at least the smallest mountains in the Appalachian Mountains, are already twice or three times the size of Mount Zion. Of course, if we compared them to the Rockies, it would just be like a speed bump, wouldn't it? So it has nothing to do with its height. It has nothing to do with anything that's up there in the sense of a natural formation. It's just green. There's not really a lot of trees. There's not any kind of like neat rock formation that people come and see. It's not full of waterfalls like Oak Mountain. Really, what's so special about Mount Zion? Well, it has nothing to do with what it is. It has everything to do with the people that have been there, right? And because of the people from Melchizedek to Jesus that have been on Mount Zion, it is the most famous mountain in the world. You would be hard-pressed to find anyone on this planet that does not know what Mount Zion is. And its world history reflects that. Mount Zion is the most coveted location ever. It has been attacked. The city of Jerusalem there has been attacked 55 times in its lifetime that we know about. It's been captured 44 times and recaptured 44 times, meaning when it changed hands of who owned it, that's happened 44 times in its lifetime. It's been sieged 23 times in its lifetime, and twice it has been completely leveled, destroyed. Such a significant city for our lifetime. When we see in Hebrews 12, which we're going to read at the end, the Hebrews writer teaches us what the word shaking means. He says shaking means a change. that God would go to Mount Zion and he would shake it up. And he would change basically the landscape, right? Anything that could be shaken would break and would fall off. But anything that God could not shake off, that was going to be permanent. That was going to be eternal. And now God presents us in Hebrews 12, not a physical Mount Zion, but a spiritual Mount Zion, a spiritual Jerusalem that is a kingdom that cannot be shaken. It cannot be changed. And so we're going to build our way up to Hebrews 12 tonight. But first what I want to do is look at all the different times we see in the Bible that the physical city of Jerusalem is conquered. And one, I think it's going to make a clear distinction between looking at this and the spiritual Zion or the spiritual Jerusalem. But two, I think it's just kind of helpful to understand the history of the city. And you're going to see a lot of Bible history play out as we go through this tonight. There's a lot of this, but I've got all the verses up here on the screen so we can move a little faster. And I'm not expecting you to pick up every single bit of information here when we talk about the physical Jerusalem. But let's talk about the physical Jerusalem or the physical Zion, Mount Zion. Our earliest record of the people that lived there would have been during Abraham's time, where he met Melchizedek, who was not the king of Jerusalem, but just the king of Salem, which the Hebrews writer tells us means peace. We're able to say that Salem is on Mount Zion, the location of Jerusalem, because of Psalm 76:2, when the psalmist Asaph tells us, and Salem also is his tabernacle and his dwelling place in Zion, putting Salem and Zion in the same place. So Melchizedek, who was high priest and king during the days of Abraham, ruled this area, and obviously he was devoted to God. There was something special about there, and he would become a messianic shadow of the job that Jesus Christ has, being high priest and king of Zion. But the place when it really picks up in the Bible and we see it being conquered is first by the Jebusites, the Canaanites that lived there. However, Joshua's group and the group in Judges both fail to take Jerusalem from the Jebusites. In Joshua 15:63, we see the tribe of Judah fell. As for the Jebusites, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the children of Judah could not drive them out, but the Jebusites dwell with the children of Judah at Jerusalem to this day. Just a little bit later in Judges 1:21, the Benjamites fell, but the children of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites who inhabited Jerusalem. So the Jebusites dwell with the children of Benjamin in Jerusalem to this day. And we're not told why the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin fail. They just do. They drive out all the Canaanites in the area, but they cannot take the fortified city Jerusalem from the Jebusites. If you can think in your own knowledge of Bible history, who is the first person that's able to take Jerusalem from the Jebusites? It's not until we get to David. David is the first person to take Jerusalem from the Jebusites in 1010 BC. We see that in 2 Samuel 5. He gives the challenge, whoever can sneak through the waterway and take the city will be my chief warrior. And Joab takes it on himself to sneak in through Jerusalem through a cave system and open the gates up for David. 2 Samuel 5 says, and the king and his men went to Jerusalem against the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land who spoke to David, saying, you shall not come in here, but the blind and the lame will repel you, thinking, David cannot come in here. Nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, that is, the city of David. I love this passage because you get to know a little bit about David's character. So David comes up against the Jebusites, and the Jebusites basically mocked David. They said, David, we're going to send our lame and our blind, and they're going to be able to hold you off from keeping the city. And there's just one little line here, in verse 7. Nevertheless, David took the stronghold, and by the way, he named the city after himself, right? And he names it the city of David, and it's called the city of David from here on out. The next thing we see is obviously Absalom. He would take Jerusalem away for David for a little while, but David would reconquer it. But the next thing we're going to see is that after David has Solomon, and Solomon, of course, becomes the powerhouse that he is with all the wealth and with all the warriors. He makes war with Egypt there a little bit at the end. But Pharaoh Shishak in Egypt is waiting and buying his time for Solomon to die. And as soon as Solomon dies, Pharaoh Shishak in Egypt gathers his forces and goes and takes Jerusalem. And what would the Pharaoh want in Jerusalem? Why would he be waiting and buying his time for Solomon to be gone for them to take it? All of Solomon's treasure, right? Solomon, through God, had made himself so wealthy, the other people in the world knew about this. And Egypt was waiting for the right moment that they could take it. And he did. He succeeded. 1 Kings 14, in the 5th year of Rehoboam, Shishak, king of Egypt, came against Jerusalem. And he took away the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house. He took away everything. He also took away all the gold shields which Solomon had made. Rehoboam, in such a poor condition after this, he can't even replace the things that Shishak sold. When it comes to the shields, he had to make them bronze instead and put those in the temple. It's hard to say Solomon, Shishak, and shields all in one sentence. But I barely did, didn't I? The next place we see that people take it is the Philistines. You're kind of around maybe the year 850. 2 Chronicles 21, because of the sins of going on in Judah, the Lord stirs up against Jehoram, king of Judah, the spirit of the Philistines and the Arabians who were near the Ethiopians. And they came up into Judah and invaded it and carried away the possessions that were found in the king's house, and also his sons and his wives, so that there was not a son left to him except Jehoahaz, the youngest of his sons. The Lord stirs up the Philistines to the point that they come in and they ransack the place. They kill all of David's family except for one, Jehoahaz. So, of course, the messianic lineage could be preserved for Christ, right? Think about this for a second. You think about all the war that the judges went against the Philistines and how Samson was a hero and kept the Philistines away from the Israelites. You think about all that David did to stop the Philistines. Obviously, most famously, killing Goliath, right? And now what are the Philistines doing? They're ransacking the city of David, right? Just from here on out, do you think Jerusalem would be like a good place to live? I mean, it is just constantly being taken and conquered and reconquered. And obviously, God's hand being all through it. Next one we'll see is Hazael of Damascus in 830. And I put this little asterisk here for my sake, because Hazael of Damascus actually didn't conquer Jerusalem. He was paid off to leave it alone, but he rose against it. 2 Kings 12, we see Hazael, king of Syria, going up and fighting against Gath, taking it. Then Hazael set his face to go to Jerusalem. Jehoash ends up gathering all of the wealth from out of the temple in his own house and ends up paying off Hazael to leave. What's sad about Hazael is that actually Elisha is the one that made him king of Syria. So before this in Israel, Elisha had gone to Damascus into Syria and found Hazael and said, God has chosen you to be king of this land. And yet Elisha cries because he knows of the future and what Hazael is going to do to the people of Israel and the people of Judah. And now you have here the city of David again, the most important city in the world, having to do what? Having to bribe someone to leave. And this is what they do for Hazael of Damascus. The next one we see is Jehoash of Israel, just a few years later. The king of Israel actually comes against King Amaziah after Amaziah threatens him and goes and ransacks the city once again in 2 Kings 14. We won't read that one. So we move on. We kind of get into the age of the Gentiles. All of those things were localized. They were happening in Canaan, and they were because of the people that Joshua's generation had failed to wipe out. When we get to Tiglath-Pileser, now the Gentiles have gotten involved into the conquerings of Jerusalem. 740 BC in 2 Chronicles 28, Tiglath-Pileser again, like Hazael of Damascus, too gets paid off to leave. Tiglath-Pileser here in verse 19, for the Lord brought Judah low because of Ahaz, king of Judah. For he has been encouraged moral decline in Judah and had been continually unfaithful to the Lord. Also, Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, came to him and distressed him and did not assist him. For Ahaz took part of the treasures from the house of the Lord, from the house of the king, from the house of the leaders, and gave it to the king of Assyria, but it did not help him. King Ahaz does so many wicked things. God sends Assyria after Jerusalem, and he again pays them off so he could leave. But apparently, according to 2 Chronicles 28, it doesn't go too well. The Assyrians never lost their interest in Jerusalem after this. And the next king, King Sennacherib, decides that he's going to go and take Jerusalem. And this might be one of the most interesting sackings of Jerusalem there ever was, simply because it didn't happen. It was stopped. Sennacherib's king of Assyria, and during the days of Hezekiah, goes and sieges the city. In 2 Kings 19, Hezekiah being faced with the biggest, baddest king there is in the time, instead of trying to war up, instead of trusting in his treasures, instead of trying to pay off Sennacherib like his fathers had done before him, instead Hezekiah gathers all the people of Jerusalem into the temple, and he leads them in prayer. And in that prayer, Hezekiah basically challenges God. You prove to yourself, to all these people, that you are our God. And you prove to Sennacherib that you rule in the nations of men. And God, I'm trusting you that you're going to save the day here, and we're going to sing praises to your name. And God is actually so happy about this that he immediately sends Isaiah to come to talk to Hezekiah and say, yeah, I'm about to do exactly what you just said. And God saves the day from Sennacherib. Here we see what God does there is Sennacherib is sieging the city and Hezekiah is inside in the temple. This happens in 19 of 2 Kings. And it came to pass on a certain night that the angel of the Lord went out, killed in the camp of the Assyrians 185,000, and whose people arose early in the morning. There were corpses all dead. So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed and went away, returned home, and remained at Nineveh. 37 gives us the end of Sennacherib's story. He ends up being murdered by one of his own sons in the temple of his God, worshiping his false god. This is the end of Sennacherib. And Hezekiah asks, God, I need you to solve this problem. And obviously God did in a really big way. That angel killed 185,000 people in one night. Can you imagine waking up in the bodies? Doesn't he react the way any of us would react? Wow, everybody, get your stuff, we're going home, right? We're not messing with this anymore. And obviously, even Sennacherib tastes a little bit of the fear of God here, doesn't he? What's interesting about this one, again, is this is the biblical record of this event. But Sennacherib kept his own records of the event that we have today. And he wrote them out here on a prism. And what's funny about Sennacherib's story is that it's a little different. What it basically says is that Sennacherib said that he went up against Hezekiah. He caged him up like a bird in a cage. And then Sennacherib says, I was thinking about it, and I was thinking, I probably am not going to do this. I'm tired of this. I'm going to go home. And that's the way Sennacherib explains why he doesn't attack Hezekiah. But of course, the Bible account is that the Lord hurt him so bad, he had to run home with his tail between his legs. Assyria takes Manasseh at some point, 2 Chronicles 33:11. We don't know much about this, but we know that the prophecy is given by God to Manasseh that he's so evil that now I'm going to have to wipe Jerusalem like a dish. But he says personally to Manasseh that he would take him into captivity. Verse 10 of chapter 33, and the Lord spoke to Manasseh and his people, but they would not listen. Therefore the Lord brought upon them the captains of the army of the king of Assyria, who took Manasseh with hooks, bound him with bronze fetters, and carried him off to Babylon. Many of us know this story that even after all the wicked things Manasseh does, he does humble himself, and he prays to God and asks for help and forgiveness. He repents. And God comes and he saves him and lets him sit back on the throne and be buried with his father, David. After this happens is when the moments happen that consider Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. And I know a lot of us have already gone over these in this classroom, and recently we went over this, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. But we do know that in the moments of Nebuchadnezzar coming to power, Jerusalem is taken and retaken and taken and retaken. And we see that happen over and over again. Pharaoh Necho kills Josiah in Megiddo in 2 Kings 23:34, and he puts his own personal king as his vassal on the throne in Jerusalem. And so then when this happened, Nebuchadnezzar in 605 comes and he's like, no, I need my guy in Jerusalem. So he sacks Jerusalem and takes all the treasure out of the temple and takes Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego back with him to Babylon. Well, what happens? Jerusalem starts getting confident. And they're like, we're going to rebel against Nebuchadnezzar. We're going to do our own thing. So Nebuchadnezzar comes back a second time. And he sacks the city. And this time he takes Ezekiel's group captive. And then what happens again? Jerusalem's like, I'm pretty confident in ourselves. I think we're going to stand up to him even though God told us not to. And so what happens a third time? Nebuchadnezzar comes back. And he sacks him a third time. And we see that happen in 2 Kings 25:1. Nebuchadnezzar comes this last time because Jerusalem has become a nuisance. They continually rebel against him, even though he obviously has control of the situation, and even though God has specifically told God's people, the Jews, over and over again through the prophets, that Nebuchadnezzar is in charge. I have chosen him to be my servant and to be the King of Kings during this time. But they continue to rebel. As we go and start, especially here with Nebuchadnezzar, you're going to see this as a theme through Jerusalem's history. The Jewish people rebel. And they get confident. And they decide, I know God said something different, but we're going to go ahead and take care of it ourselves. And that always ends up in trouble for them. Nebuchadnezzar is the first complete destruction of Jerusalem. He destroys the temple, he destroys the city walls, and there's nothing left. 2 Kings 25:1 says, "Now it came to pass in the 9th year of his reign, in the 10th month, on the 10th day of the month, that Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, his army, came against Jerusalem and encamped against it, and they built a siege wall against it around." And here is just the beginning of the end. Nebuchadnezzar sieges them for a whole year, starves them out. It's just miserable. It's awful. It's the worst time to be alive. And he ends up destroying the city and the temple. Many of us know what happens next, and it's kind of the end of the Bible story, right? Daniel's able to preserve his people in captivity in Babylon. Eventually the Persians come to power. Esther is in charge. Esther takes care and preserves the people. Ezra is sent back to rebuild the temple. Nehemiah is sent back to rebuild the walls. And things finally look like they're going to be really good. And God is preparing the world for the coming of Christ, the Messiah. And Jesus is on his way. And I'm going to go through these next relatively quickly. But there is some more times Jerusalem is conquered again where Nehemiah ends and before Matthew begins. And just kind of going through this quickly. The Jews, after Nehemiah is dead, get confident once again in Jerusalem. And they're thinking, we can take care of ourselves, and we're kind of tired of paying this guy taxes, and maybe we're going to do our own thing. So the Jews rebel again. Artaxerxes III comes and conquers them again. And the Persians establish control out of Jerusalem. By the way, just like Daniel said it would happen. Daniel also prophesied in chapter 8 that the king of Greece would one day be in charge of the known world. And we see that happening with the next conquering. Alexander the Great in 332 comes and he conquers the city of Jerusalem. However, what we know historically, it was the nicest conquering that's ever happened. As Alexander the Great goes to Jerusalem, Josephus says that the high priest ran out to meet him and said, basically, we already have it in a book in one of our prophets that you were going to take over, so we surrender. And because the Jews here finally are obedient to what the prophets commanded them to do, the city is spared. Alexander the Great walks just right around it. And the legend is that Alexander the Great was so amazed by Daniel 8 and his prophecy that he kept a copy of Daniel with him for the rest of his life. That's just legend and speculation, but I like it, so I repeated it. The next person that takes it, we'll go through these fast, is Ptolemy the First. Daniel prophesied, and we'll see this in our study this coming quarter, that after Alexander the Great dies, it would split up into 4 kingdoms. 4 generals take over Greece. One of them was Ptolemy, and he takes Jerusalem in 320. Antiochus the Great takes it over in 200, one of the other family of the generals that was left over from Alexander the Great. Judas of Maccabees, however, doesn't like this. And many of us are maybe familiar with the Maccabean revolt. What happens is even though Daniel prophesied about these things in chapter 11 and Daniel chapter 8, and tells the people that, hey, these things can't be solved by human agency. God says he's going to deal with these things. You need to be peaceable, and you need to obey the authorities that are in front of you. However, this guy right here, Judas of Maccabeus, decides, nah, I can do it on my own. And he leads a 7-year rebellion against the Greeks. And ultimately, it ends with his death. And just a complete wipe out of any kind of loyalty the Jewish people had to Judaism. It's really sad. And again, what you see is God has a plan. God says, I don't want you to be afraid. Here's a prophet that's already told you what's going to happen. Don't expect any surprises. And you trust in me. But you have people that don't trust in God and decide they're going to fix it with their own hands. And every time we try to fix something with our own hands that God said only he can fix, we always end up with what? A complete mess. And this is what the Maccabean revolt led to. This is all stopped when Pompey the Great finally arrives from Rome and takes over Jerusalem. The Pharisees allow him to sneak in to push the Sadducees out of the temple, and now Rome is in control of Judah. Then we get through the time of Jesus and the time of the apostles. And they're going to live in relatively peace there in Judah in terms of world powers. Obviously, the Jewish Sanhedrin is going to heavily persecute them. There's going to be a lot of persecution coming out of Jerusalem. And eventually in 66 AD, this man, Simon Bar Giora, I always struggle with his name, decides to kind of do what Judas decided to do. He's going to lead a new rebellion. And he believes he can throw off Rome finally, and he tries to do that. When he throws off Rome and tries to basically kick them out of the nation, Rome obviously isn't happy about this. And Nero sends Vespasian the general to come down and to wipe out the Jews. That's what Nero's solution is to this. Vespasian travels through around the Mediterranean. He comes down, he takes the area of Galilee. Josephus, the historian, this is when he's captured and he defects and lives with the Romans and writes all this history for us to have. When these things happen, they're on their way to Jerusalem, and Nero's assassinated and killed. Vespasian has to stop. My marching orders have changed. The emperor's dead. He returns to Rome and ultimately declares himself emperor. And when he declares himself emperor, he sends his son Titus to go finish the job that he began back in 66. And that was to wipe out the Jews. Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem out of annoyance. Titus destroyed Jerusalem out of anger and out of hate. And when you read some of the historical documents, mainly from what Josephus saw firsthand, it is terrifying what Titus does to these people. And it makes so much sense why Jesus wept for the city, knowing that this was going to happen to him. Jesus gave Jerusalem so many fair warnings that they would be destroyed. He even tells them things like this. In Luke 11, Jesus says, "Therefore the wisdom of God also says, I will send them prophets and apostles, and some of them will kill and persecute, that the blood of the prophets which was shed on the foundation of the world may be required of this generation. From the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, who perished between the altar and the temple, yes, I say to you, it shall be required of this generation." Jesus tells them that the blood from Abel, the one who Cain killed his brother, all the way the blood of Zechariah the prophet, who we learn here was actually killed in the temple between the altar, that he said that this generation, the generation that was alive when Jesus was speaking to them, was going to have to pay for this. So they have been given a timeline. They're supposed to expect it soon, aren't they? He even gives them even more information. In Luke 21, Jesus says, "But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that this a desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those who are in the midst of her depart, and let not those who are in the country enter her." Meaning when Titus comes back and you see the Roman armies heading towards Jerusalem, what do you need to do? Do you need to stay and fight? Jesus says, run for your life. He even tells them where to run to. Go to the mountains. Now we've been in the mountains over on the other side of the Jordan River. And Josephus records that not a single Christian died in the siege of Jerusalem because the Christians did what Jesus told them to do, which was to flee to the mountains. We could continue on and do more conquering of Jerusalem, but we're going to stop here with Titus. Some of you are sad about that, and some of you are thankful. But here, let's make our point about all this. We saw here all the conquerings of Zion, and we see that this physical kingdom is constantly changing, isn't it? You don't know what week it is of who's in charge, right? And people ask, well, who's in charge of Jerusalem? You got to say, well, in what year? Sometimes you got to ask, in what month? Because it's a constant changing of who's in control of this place. Would you consider Jerusalem to be a stable city? It's all over the place. We've even talked about during some of these times, this wouldn't have been a place you wanted to live because of how just crazy it was. Things were constantly moving. There was no one to trust. You just were kind of up in the air. Of course, we wanted to trust in God, but God often would tell you actually to leave to solve the problems. Let's compare that to another Zion, or let's compare that to another Jerusalem. What about the heavenly Jerusalem, or the spiritual Zion that God talks about in Hebrews chapter 12? If you already turned there, and maybe you've been there the whole time waiting to read it, let me explain what's going on here in the Hebrews writer's mind, and then we're just going to read it. I really don't have to do a lot of explaining till after we're done reading. The Hebrews writer is trying to talk to Jewish Christians about why it's going to be okay that Jerusalem isn't going to exist anymore. And he's trying to tell them that those that are Christians that are trying to return to Judaism, those that are trying to return to the temple and leaving Jesus behind, are not going to have anything. They're putting their hope and their faith in something that's temporary and not something that's eternal like Jesus Christ. He's going to compare Mount Sinai to the heavenly Jerusalem. The heavenly Jerusalem being the kingdom of God that we're a part of because we're a part of the Lord's church. And he's saying, look how much better you have it if you put your trust and your faith in God's spiritual kingdom rather than in his physical kingdom of Jerusalem. Something that we will never understand is the way Jewish Christians felt about the temple and about this city that we've been talking about. The temple was so much more than just a national thing. You know, there was a national element. It was part of their national identity that this was their city, Jerusalem, and this was their temple. But there's something even more, that it was a spiritual identity. And as Christians, we don't really have anything I can compare that to. You know, can I say, can you imagine the temple being destroyed? It would be like Bob Waldron's material being destroyed for all time. That doesn't even get close, right? But there's so few things that are physical that we care so much about that we put our spiritual identity on to compare it to. But they did. And thirdly, for a lot of these people, Jerusalem was home. It was the place that they grew up. It was the place that their parents grew up and their grandparents grew up. And now Jesus is telling them they have to flee. And the Hebrews writer is telling them not to trust in the physical Jerusalem, but in the spiritual Jerusalem. Let's read this now. Hebrews 12, verse 18. For you have not come to the mountain that may be touched and burned with fire, into blackness and darkness and tempest, and the sound of the trumpet and the voice of words, so that those who heard it begged that the word should not be spoken to them anymore. For they could not endure what was commanded, and if so much as a beast touches the mountain, we're talking about Mount Sinai, it shall be stoned or shot with an arrow. And so terrifying to the sight that Moses said, I'm exceedingly afraid and trembling. But you have come to Mount Zion, and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, to an innumerable company of angels, to the general assembly and church of the firstborn who are registered in heaven, to God, the judge of all, to the spirits of just men made perfect, to Jesus, the mediator of the new covenant, and to the blood of the sprinkling that speaks better than things of Abel. See that you do not refuse him who speaks. For if they did not escape who refused him who spoke on earth, much more shall we not escape if we turn away from him who speaks from heaven, whose voice then shook the earth. And now he has promised, saying, yet once more I shake, not only the earth, but also heaven. Now this, yet once more, indicates the removal of things that are being shaken, as of things that are made, that the things which cannot be shaken may remain. Therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom which cannot be shaken, let us have grace, by which we may serve God acceptably with reverence and godly fear, for our God is a consuming fire. What he's saying here is that you are now part of a Jerusalem that's so great, it cannot be conquered. It cannot change. We just looked at all of the conquerors of the physical Jerusalem. We just saw all the people that took it and took it back and took it and took it back, and it was just complete chaos, wasn't it? There's only one up here. Who is the one person that has conquered the heavenly Jerusalem, the spiritual Mount Zion? There's one. It's Jesus. And he's it. And there's even a promise here that God makes, saying that, if shaking is something that makes things change, he says, I've already shaken it once. And now everything that's here that remains is eternal. And it's permanent. You can't put your faith and your trust in physical Jerusalem. It's going to change any day. But you can put your faith and trust in God's spiritual kingdom, the heavenly Jerusalem, because it's never going to change. And it's exactly the way it is. Can I leave you with 3 applications? They're here in verse 28. Since we live in this spiritual kingdom that Jesus has conquered with no one that could possibly stand against him, the Hebrews writer gives us three thoughts. The first one is this: since we are receiving a kingdom which cannot be shaken. Since we're receiving something that cannot be broken, that cannot be taken away from us. You think about when Jesus talks about laying your treasures up in heaven. He says, lay your treasures up in heaven instead of on earth, because on earth it can be stolen and it can erode and you can lose it and not have a clue where you put it. Something I've been trying to work especially on myself, and Emily keeps on hearing me say it, like talking to myself in the house, is I'm trying right now to stop having love and care for my possessions. And my possessions that aren't necessarily costly, but my possessions that mean something to me. If you asked Andrew what his treasures on earth would be, it would be like his lunch pail that his great-granddad used to carry to lunch in the mine. You know, that's one of my treasures, right? And in that lunch pail, I have some marbles my granddad gave me. You know, that's one of my treasures here on this earth. I have some glow-in-the-dark paint that a friend that I had that passed away when we were real young grabbed one time and put all over his face, thinking that at nighttime his face would be glowing in the dark. It didn't work, and he got some kind of rash. I have that bottle, and that's one of my treasures. I'm beating myself up because I think I left my granddad's fillet knife in my tackle box. I have no clue where my tackle box is. And I've been beating myself up about that. But you know what I keep on trying to tell myself? Those things are things that can be lost, that can be stolen, that can rot away. Those are things that can be shaken. And those are things that are temporary. The physical Jerusalem is something that can be destroyed, something that is temporary. Why don't instead we put our faith and our trust in eternal things? Things that we're not going to misplace. Things like our brethren that are also eternal. Things like God's church, which is permanent and eternal. Our faith and our hope and our love in God's word, which endures forever. Why don't we instead put our love and our devotion we have towards some of those things into eternal things? The second thing I have here in verse 28, he says, since we are in a kingdom that cannot be shaken, number two, let us have grace. Have you ever been in a room before where you felt like you didn't deserve to be there because of all the other people there? You know, maybe you walked into a party when you were young, not like a crazy party, you know what I mean, like a friendly gathering, and everyone there was a grade older than you. Did you feel like you didn't deserve to be there? Maybe everyone there was a whole lot more attractive than you, and maybe a whole lot cooler than you in some way, and you thought. Did you feel humble in that situation? Did you think, man, maybe I shouldn't be here? Have you ever been in a room where you thought everyone was smarter than you? I've been times like, you know, being a little bit of a preacher that, you know, other Bible teachers that I really have a lot of respect for will invite me into their home and want to talk to me about the Bible. And I'm there surrounded by men and women that I've always looked up to and respected because of their Bible knowledge. Do you think I talk a lot in those situations? No, I stay as quiet as possible. And I try to do a lot of listening. I try to be very humble. I try to be a lot of graceful, right? Because I don't feel like I deserve to be there. And we don't feel like we deserve to be somewhere. Do we not give a lot of grace? If you're part of the Lord's church, let me describe to you who's all in your room. It's here in verse 22. But you've come to Mount Zion, to a city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, to an innumerable company of angels, to the general assembly and church of the firstborn, to God, the judge of all, and in verse 24, to Jesus, the mediator of the new covenant. Do we deserve to be in the room that we're in? Talk about being humble. We're part of a kingdom that has an innumerable amount of angels. We're part of a kingdom that has Elijah and Elisha and Paul and Peter in it. We're part of a kingdom in a room where God, the judge of all, and Jesus Christ is there in the room with us. So when we realize we're in a room we don't deserve to be, what's supposed to be our response? We're supposed to have grace. Are we treating our brethren like we don't deserve to be in the room? Sometimes instead we treat our brethren like they don't deserve to be in the room. When in reality, brethren, none of us deserve to be in the room. And if we can understand that, we can have grace. Finally here, let us have grace by which we may serve God acceptably with reverence and godly fear. For our God is a consuming fire. My second concern, or my third concern, is sometimes we've been a part of this for so long, we get very comfortable. And basically, we've been part of God's kingdom for so long, we understand what we need to do, we've already done it. We get complacent, right? And maybe sometimes we put our life with God on autopilot. Let's never, ever make a relationship with God something commonplace. Let's never, ever make worship to our God as something commonplace. Let's never, ever make our devotion to God as something commonplace. Why? Because our God is a consuming fire. And even though God loves us and God has given us everything we ever need, He is still God. And He deserves nothing but reverence and respect for that, doesn't He? If there's anyone here tonight that you think you've forgotten about God, and you think you put that on autopilot, can we remind you of the heavenly kingdom that we're a part of? And all the wonderful things God has given us? Why don't we have grace? And why don't we have humility and ensure that we are in good with the kingdom of God, the only kingdom there is, the only kingdom we can truly put our trust in, the only kingdom that's eternal? If we can assist you with that, why don't you come forward as we stand and sing?